Hello, students. This is Ann Babson again. I am delighted to be talking to you about one of the most important thinkers in the entire history of America, a man who, I exaggerate not when I tell you, he invents American poetry. He plain old invents it. It's one thing to be a great poet or a great writer of some other kind. It's another thing to truly invent the voice of a nation's poetry, the way poetry generally gets written in a country. I will never do it. Um, and no one else will in American letters. This is the inventor of what makes us different from the British and from any other European country in poetry. Walt Whitman. And I have a particularly soft place in my heart for him because he's a Brooklyn boy. He's from Brooklyn originally, and so am I. I am from Brooklyn. If you looked at this guy at a party, you wouldn't be overly impressed. I admit it too. Perhaps this man doesn't look like the most important writer of at least 100 years, but he truly is, because he is so innovative. He breaks all the rules and he does so with great success. I cannot say too much about how the book you see pictured here, Leaves of Grass, to which he added throughout his life. Whitman only publishes one book, but he publishes multiple versions. He just keeps adding to it. Um, I cannot overstate that what Walt Whitman did to change the American language, to change what I would teach you in a class like this, and indeed to change the way that I myself write. You surely remember the poet Phyllis Wheatley. We read her earlier in the course. She is a very good poet. And she was the first American writer to actually make her living as a creative writer. She did not make a lot of money, and she died young of a fever, unfortunately. And she's very important as a founding mother of American literature, but she never tried to sound particularly American, whatever that might mean. She didn't consider herself an American poet. She wanted to write like a British poet. I'm going to show you what I mean. She wanted to sound like this dude, Alexander Pope, who is not my favorite poet. Uh, I don't like his work. Um, Pope was a quintessentially British writer with all the pretensions imaginable of the old world. And I'm going to read to you out loud this passage so you can just hear how stinking pretentious this thing is. This is from his poem Windsor Forest, just a short passage from a longer poem. Proud Nimrod first the bloody chase began, a mighty hunter, and his prey was man. Our haughty Norman boasts that barbarous name, and made his trembling slaves the royal game. The fields are ravished from the industrious swains, from men their cities, and from gods their fanes. The levelled towns with weeds lie covered d'or. The hollow winds through naked temples roar, round broken columns clasping, ivy twined, o'er heaps of ruin stalked the stately hind. The fox obscene to gaping tombs retires, and savage howlings till the sacred choirs. Yeah, that's not an American poem. Whatever that is, it's not an American poem. That Wheatley took in her work that we could notice. The first is it rhymes. Many American poems rhyme, including Wheatley's. Um, it's written in iambic pentameter, which is the rhythm, the flow of Shakespeare's plays. It's a standard rhythm, a standard meter used in much poetry, including I've written some poems that have been published in iambic pentameter, although I don't write like that. Um, It is pretentious in its evocation of mythical and historical figures of great legendary renown. The mighty Norman, Nimrod, the gods. Oh my goodness, so stinking pretentious. In Brooklyn, we would smack you upside the head, and I won't say the word that begins with F, but who do you effing think you effing are, you effing F? That is the Brooklyn response to that poem. It does not describe a scene that any average person, a worker, a clerk, a member of the middle class, might recognize from daily life. Has what happened in that poem ever happened to you? Me neither. It seems in its fancy language to want to take a curtain call. It's almost like he's saying, no autographs, please, no flash photography. Yes, you have noticed. I use words skillfully. And in fact, this was the fashion in his day. He may have made the fashion somewhat in the 1700s. But this is what Wheatley was after, but there's nothing plain spoken or humanizing about it. It's high-minded in a certain way. I personally find it pompous AF. She wanted, though, to sound like Alexander Pope because he was the most respected writer of his day in Great Britain and in the colonies. So wanting to sound like the person considered the best is an understandable ambition for a writer. And as a woman of color, she was particularly conscious of the insults against women who were thought not to be able to write whatever their color, and certainly of people of color. And so she wanted to prove to the world that she was as talented and smart as any white person or any male writer, that she could do the things that Pope might do in a poem. And indeed, with that measuring stick, she is successful. And that may have been a very important political end for her, as well as a personal source of satisfaction. And I think she honestly liked his poetry. I don't. But why should Phyllis Wheatley agree with me about that? I see no reason why someone else might not like Alexander Pope. I just don't. And in the defense of anyone writing in the years that Phyllis Wheatley was writing, there was no United States of America. Let's remember that. There is no America. She does in her later life write to George Washington, who's a new figure fighting for there to be an America. But the people who living on this continent who became Americans after the end of the Revolutionary War are still British subjects when she's writing. And her education is given to her in Massachusetts and has a distinctly British orientation. It's natural enough given the time and the place. And so Wheatley wanted to be respected as a thinker in that place and time. Why wouldn't she want to sound like the person they admired the most in poetry as a poet? It makes perfect sense. That said, she doesn't invent something new. She does an awfully good job of being herself in that idiom, which is different. Whitman, on the other hand, is crazy new. He rejects every bit of that style that we just talked about in Pope's work, and he seeks an American style. And at the time that others are reinventing government, citizenship, religion, and other parts of the culture, Walt Whitman reinvents American poetry. No joke. Just listen, you just heard Alexander Pope's work. I'm going to take a sip of Diet Coke, and I'm going to read to you the first section of Song of the Open Road. And I want you to listen to the differences. Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. Henceforth I ask not good fortune, I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing. Done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms, strong and content I travel the open road. The earth, that is sufficient. I do not want the constellations any nearer. I know they are very well where they are. I know they suffice for those who belong to them. Still here I carry my old delicious burdens. I carry them, men and women. I carry them with me wherever I go. I swear it is impossible for me to get rid of them. I'm filled with them, and I will fill them in return. Oh, such good writing. Okay, it doesn't rhyme. First lesson. It doesn't have a single flow. It has an urgency of cadence, but it does not have a fixed meter the way iambic pentameter does, or indeed how many people who are doing hip hop have fixed meter, or other poets using other specific metrical conceits. It doesn't really use any mythological figures. There's this guy, he doesn't want the constellations any nearer. And even where you could turn something into an allegorical figure. An allegorical figure, you probably learned this in high school, an allegorical figure represents something you can't see, but that you know exists. An example of an American allegorical figure is the Statue of Liberty. Liberty is something you're sure exists, for at least some people, and you cannot see it. You can't say, oh my goodness, look in that corner over there. There's some liberty stuck to the wall. That's not how liberty works. But we look at that statue, and she is an allegorical figure representing the phenomenon of liberty. So good fortune could be an allegorical figure. You could walk with someone who is good fortune. And that was actually in fashion in Europe at that time to write stuff like that. But that's not what he does. He says, good fortune, I myself am good fortune, he says. So there's no allegorical hoop-de-doo. There's just this guy who's taking a long hike on the open road. And the open road is an equal opportunity setting. And anybody who isn't afraid of a long, long walk can get on the road with him. There are no rules about that. And the language of Whitman is more or less a contemporary American voice. No snootiness in his tone. I know that we don't say things like, let me find a phrase. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more. We don't really use the word henceforth. We don't talk about querulous criticisms, but these were pretty common American words at the time. He is not like Pope turning up the snooty full blast. On the contrary, he's turning it down. And he's just talking to you straight at you, and me straight at me. And the poem is about a mortal human experience, no pompous occasion. It's not like we have gods hunting man and some mighty Norman and some obscene fox or whatever else Pope decided to stick in his pretentious poem. This is about a person who is not so unlike us we cannot decide we might know him. He certainly thinks about us, and that's another thing super interesting. At first, people don't get it. It's not like other poetry they've read, so they say, is this supposed to be poetry? They say they don't understand why there are no gods and allegorical figures. That was super in style in Europe. Why was Whitman not doing any of that? It doesn't rhyme. What the heck? He's the first poet who doesn't rhyme. And where's the iambic pentameter? Everybody knows that good writers write in iambic pentameter, right? Well, apparently not all Americans do. And Whitman doesn't manage to sell too many of his books, Leaves of Grass, but he works as a writer for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Brooklyn at this time is its own city just outside of New York City, and people take a ferry across, hence crossing Brooklyn Ferry, to go to work and other things, but it's considered its own city and it has its own newspaper until the early 20th century. And he works there as a writer, and he is, when I say he's a shameless self-promoter, I cannot even tell you how ridiculously uh, shameless he is. He writes anonymously these reviews of his own book, telling people it's a great book, it's a work of unprecedented genius. Now, I'm not shy about telling you I'm proud of my poetry, but my goodness. I would never pretend it wasn't my voice because of how ridiculous I would look if I were ever caught. And also, B, I'm humble enough to know that even though I love my work, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to tell you that I've invented American poetry or something equally pompous or strange, but he tells people this in these anonymous reviews he writes in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And where we come from, Walt Whitman and I, today, a woman would turn to another woman and say, "Oh my God, who does that? Who does that?" When somebody acts rude, crude, or socially unacceptably, that's what we say. Who does that? It's really wrong that he does that. But he does get the attention that his work actually deserves of being an innovator. And from people other than himself, people start to read his work, uh, including Emerson, who writes him a nice letter that's in your book. And he is right, actually. He may be shamelessly self-promoting, but he's not wrong about what he's done. He isn't just a legend in his own mind. He's done something really forward-thinking and impressive and good. He he writes about things, um, and my advice, if you want to understand his poems, is assume every poem he writes is a love poem to strangers, to people he never met before. Whitman loves people, loves them with a white hot passion, and he loves them from afar. He's got a crush on everybody. Um, and he even has a crush on us in the future. He loves us. He loves us. And he writes to us at moments in his poetry as if we were his most intimate lovers. And I would specifically ask you to notice this in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He doesn't start out with this intimate voice. He's like some guy we meet at a bus station telling us something. Maybe he's crazy about the people and things he sees, but he keeps going closer. He even says, "Closer yet I approach you." And then by the end, he's calling us by our nighest name, which means our nearest. Only our BFF knows this nickname name. And then there's this unspoken understanding with us. It's very beautiful. Oh my God, it's gorgeous. You're going to love it. And he loves us, the future Americans. And it's very moving. He's in love with us from across space and time. And you will notice that another thing that characterizes much of Whitman is he writes in these super long verses. And he is fond in many poems, particularly Crossing Brooklyn Ferry and Song of Myself, of these lists of things, almost an inventory he's taking. It's almost like he's in the stock room taking inventory, but this list becomes a love song to us all, to himself and to others with whom he is connected. He believes in the idea of the oversoul. He's not just about himself. To love. He believes he is connected with all of us, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of even time and space. Anyone who reads him is his beloved. And he shares a conviction that our lives are inherently sacred. Like he says, I myself am good fortune in that passage I read to you. The sacred space is wherever we are. It's not necessarily a church or a temple, but in nature, in the city streets, and even in our own bodies. Our own bodies are temples. And I've never read anyone whose work is more profoundly optimistic. He believes in America's possibilities. He believes in this country in ways that it is hard to believe in anything but God. And all of us together are destined, in his view, for some kind of undefined, as of yet, mystical greatness. It's so moving. It's so lovely. And another thing to keep in mind about Whitman is he's queer. He may have had love affairs with women, but he sure as heck did with men. And there isn't a word for it. The word homosexual is used only in a clinical, medical, could get you thrown in jail, psychological, criminal way in the late 1800s. He's having sex with men in the 1840s, and there isn't an English word for it. And he is not a guy who thinks he needs to apologize for this. Remember that the transcendentalists kind of feel free to examine their own conscience and invent their own sense of sexual morality, even between men and women, not just between men and men. And he writes these magnificent words that are sometimes used in things like wedding vows and wedding invitations. Even though I married a man and am a heterosexual woman and am even just a boring heterosexual woman in so many ways, I thought seriously about putting this on my wedding invitation. Listen to what he writes. Camarado, I give you my hand. I give you my love more precious than money. I give you myself before preaching or law. Will you give me yourself? Will you come travel with me? Shall we stick by each other as long as we live? Isn't that American? And isn't it transcendental? I give you myself before preaching or law. I don't need no stinking preacher to marry you, and I don't need a piece of paper to say we're married. And my love is more precious than money. Money won't make you happy. Love will. And I give you my hand. These are American sentiments, and deeply unconventional, most particularly because he's writing them in the mid-1800s to a man. So I just have to say, he's unashamed of himself and he's unashamed of us, the USA. And he loves our many possibilities. He is down with whatever we want to become that's noble and good to others. And his work to me feels particularly modern. This does not feel 150 years old when I read him. He invented the language and method poets often use in this country. And because he was avant-garde, meaning so forward-thinking in his approach to writing and seeing the world, he really does contribute to how Americans think today. And I was struck by the fact that these two guys from Williamsburg don't look that different from Walt Whitman. Not everybody in Brooklyn has a beard. I certainly don't have a beard. But there is something so modern about Whitman. You could totally see him going into this hipster, organic, whatever store that these guys are running in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with that hat on and that outfit, buying whatever he wanted. You could really imagine it, or at least I could. I hope you enjoy his work. You can certainly hear the way I'm talking. I am madly in love with his work, and I owe all the good ideas I've ever had in poetry, at least a little bit, to Whitman. And so thank you, Walt Whitman, and thank you, students, for listening. I hope this lecture is helpful to you.